In this video, we are going to talk about undefined expressions, specifically what values will make an expression undefined. So, anytime we try to divide by 0, we will make an expression undefined. That's the starting point for all of this. Usually problems that ask you to find values where an expression will be undefined involve fractions and will involve variables as well. If the bottom of a fraction becomes 0, the expression will be undefined. So your goal is to find which values will make an expression undefined when the bottom of a fraction contains a variable. The value of the variable that will make the bottom of the fraction equal to 0 is the number that you're looking for. This will make more sense once we get to some examples. I'm going to show you some kinds of expressions where you might be asked this question. Here's one. The key here is to really ignore the top of the fraction and focus on the bottom. We'll look at steps in a minute. Here we can see that we have 4 minus x on the bottom of the fraction. That's really where our attention is going to be. When the top of the fraction gets ugly, like in this second example, you don't have to really worry about that. It has nothing to do with this question. It's just there to make it look kind of ugly and difficult. It's really the bottom of these fractions that we're focused on. So let's take a look at some steps that you can use to solve these problems. Here's an example. We have 8x plus 4 over x plus 2. Ignore the top of the fraction. It's not important for these problems. I'm going to demonstrate that by kind of crossing this out. We are not looking at that at all. The next thing that we want to do is to set the bottom of the fraction equal to 0. That might be a confusing instruction, but this is what I mean by that. We have x plus 2 on the bottom. Let's just over here, we're going to write x plus 2 equals 0. And then the next step is solve for the variable. So we're going to use algebra here to solve for x. In this case, it's pretty simple. We're going to subtract 2 from both sides, cancel that out, and we get x is equal to minus 2. That's the number that we're looking for, because if we substitute that back in, we would get negative 2 plus 2. That would be 0, and we can't divide by 0. That's what we're looking for. That's what makes an expression undefined. Now, in this case, you might have not needed to do this elaborate, it's not really elaborate, but the step of setting this equation up equal to 0, because you could see that if x was negative 2, that this would be 0. And in simpler problems, that's the case. But in the more difficult examples, you might need to take this more formal step. So let's take a look at 5 examples here. What value of x will make this expression undefined? Once again, we're ignoring the top of the fraction, and we set the bottom equal to 0. 4x is equal to 0. Now, in this case, we would divide both sides by 4, because that's what's going to get x all by itself. And that leaves us with x is equal to 0 divided by 4. 0 divided by 4 is still 0, and the answer is 0. So whenever you have a number multiplied by a variable, and that's the only thing in the denominator of a fraction, then the answer will be x equals 0. So it's kind of a common example. What value of y will make the expression undefined? It doesn't matter what the variable is. It doesn't need to be x. So in this case, we would set up 4 minus y equals 0. We would subtract 4 from both sides. That gives us negative y equals negative 4. Now, you might recall from algebra that we're not trying to solve for negative y, we're trying to solve for y. So we need to somehow get rid of this negative sign. The way we can do that is to multiply both sides by -1. That gives us y equals 4. And when we look back at this, that makes perfect sense because 4 minus 4 is 0. That's why 4 makes sense as an answer for example number 2. What value of x will make the expression undefined? Now, the top of this fraction is pretty ugly, but we're going to ignore it. The bottom is a little bit more complicated in this case, so we want to be careful with this one. But we're just going to, so I wrote that wrong. This should be 5 plus x. 2 times 5 plus x equals 0. We're going to start out by dividing both sides by 2. Kind of doing PEMDAS in reverse. And that leaves us with 5 plus x equals 0 divided by 2. Anything that we divide into 0 is still 0. And then finally, we will subtract 5 from both sides. And we get x is equal to -5. Now, it's always a good idea to test your answer here. Does this number make this 0? So we could just substitute that in. You can do this with your calculator. I would suspect that most of the time when you have problems like this, you will be allowed to use your calculator and see what we get here. It's 2 times 0, and that's equal to 0. That's what we were looking for. So our answer here, we have multiple choice to work with in this example, is x is equal to -5. We'll make that expression undefined. Example 4. What value of z will make the expression undefined? Once again, the variable does not matter. We're ignoring the top, and we're setting 8 minus 2z equals 0. Now, if you can look at this and you see the number that will make this equal to 0, that's great. Go with it. Otherwise, do this step. The third option I will talk about in a moment, but let's review the algebra here. We're going to subtract 8 from both sides. That leaves us with -2z equals -8. We want to divide by what z is being multiplied by. That's -2. And that cancels out the -2, and it leaves us with z equals 4. Now, let's say that you were having trouble arriving at this solution. Test these answers. Plug these answers or possible answers into this expression, and the one that gives you 0 will be the correct answer. Now, in this case, it happened to be answer A. If we plugged that in and we said 8 minus 2 times 4, is that equal to 0? Yes, it is. That's our answer. None of these other 3 answers will work if we do that same thing. So this is another avenue that you have to test these answers and figure out which one gives you the right solution. So for example, B will give you 16. That's not right. We could try C, 8 minus 2 times 3. That will give you the number 2. So I hope you're following along with your calculator and working these out with me. 8 minus 2, that's good practice. 6, this is going to give us a -4. So just a reminder, if you're given 4 answers, only one of them will work, and this is a good way to test it. Last example. This is the most difficult of these, but I wanted you to see this kind of denominator at least once. Let's set this up. A squared minus 16 equals 0. We add 16 to both sides, and we get a squared equals 16. Now, How do we find out what a is when we know that a squared is equal to 16? Well, we can take the square root of both sides. And that will give us a is equal to 4, but it could also be equal to -4. This is a little bit of a quirk of taking square roots, is we don't know whether that number is positive or negative. We haven't talked about that before, but keep that in mind. When you're looking at the answers, you should only see either a negative or a positive of the number you came up with as your square root. And there's our answer, D4. Again, in a case where you have something squared in the denominator, it might be best to work your way through these answers and figure out which one works. 16 squared minus 16 is not going to be equal to 0. 2 squared minus 16 is not going to be equal to 0, as is 32 squared minus 16. Only 4 squared minus 16 is equal to 0. All right, that's it for this video. Now it's time for you to do some practice on your own.